on presenting our paper, How Interpretable and Trustworthy Are Games. I'm Kingsley, and this is the joint work with Sarah, Ben, Anna, and Rich. To start with, what is the generalized additive models? First, we show the functional form of the familiar linear model, which is the linear weighted sum of the features. For generalized linear model, we have this G-linked function. So if G is a logit, it becomes logistic regression. Additive model, on the other hand, will have independent shape function fj of x that for each individual feature j. Note that there is no feature interaction in this model, and each feature operates on its own. And we have generalized additive model, which we also have this G-link function in y. Finally, we have our full complexity model, like deep neural net or random forest, which can use all the feature interactions in the data. So in GAN, we can visualize each independent fj of x as a graph. So that's why GAM is interpretable. Here we showed an example shape graph from GAM from Rich Caruana 2015 that they trained a GAM on the pneumonia datasets to predict mortality. Here, x-axis shows feature age, and y-axis show the fj of x, which is kind of like log odds that after sigmoid, the value in y-axis becomes probability. And first, we see that there's a jump around age 67, which could be due to the retirement effect. After retirement, the lifestyle of patients changes and might lead to higher risk of mortality. We can also see a jump around age 85, and it could be due to the treatment effects that clinicians treat patients differently above or below 85. Lastly, we see a drop around 100. It could be due to the overfitting, or it could be another treatment effect. So overall, these graphs are interpretable, and we can view independent shape graphs and propose interesting hypotheses to understand our data. So the graph looks great, but are they true? Also, Rich Caruana only shows one type of game. How about other games? Do they show the same pattern? Lastly, how do we even compare different games? So to motivate our paper, we find that in this data set, we show a feature length of stay on the compass data. And we show that three equally accurate games, which have around 85 AUC, show very different patterns in this feature. For example, Spline, the orange one, shows the risk grows strongly with the length of stay after 300. The blue one, EBM Best First, shows that interesting ups and downs. And the green one, the Flan one, basically shows that once the length of stay is above 0, the risk is basically the same. So in this case, these scams show very different or even contradictory patterns on this feature while having the same accuracy. Which one should we trust? Our contributions are listed as follows. First, we show that similarly accurate games can have different explanations, highly affected by their own inductive bias. Sparse games, which means scams that only uses a few important features to make predictions, for example like L1 penalized model, can hide patterns on weaker features and incur higher loss on rare subpopulations. Third, we measure how well different games recover data patterns, which we call data fidelity. We also propose two metrics to measure sparsity and data fidelity. Finally, we recommend tree-based games over other games due to their low feature sparsity and higher data fidelity. Here we show different games we experiment in our paper. First, EBM, Explainable Boosting Machine, is the model used by Rich Caruana 2015 that I just showed you guys a couple slides before. It is quite similar to gradient boosted tree, but it is designed to use as many features as possible to make predictions. To illustrate our point of feature sparsity, We also create a variant called EBM Best First, which is the orange here, that it is designed to use fewer important features to make predictions. Second, we investigate using XGBoost. Normally, XGBoost is not a GAM, but we make it as a GAM by limiting the depth of tree to be 1. So there is no feature interaction allowed in this model, which makes it as a GAM. Okay. Third, we compare with Spline, which is the original GAM published back in the 80s. Its shape graph is designed to be smooth as shown in the orange line. We also compare with FLAN, Fused Lasso Additive Model, and you can see that the graph is pretty flat and jumpy. Lastly, we create some strawman baselines that include logistic regression and linear model with different basis functions. So how do we judge which GAM is better? So we start with test accuracy, since it is widely adopted in model selection. Here we show 10 different binary classification datasets, and we show the accuracy of all the GAM models that we experiment with and the full complexity models. Here I want you guys to focus on the summary statistics, the average AUC, average ranks, and normalized AUC. Overall, the best models, EBM XGBoost and XGBoost Step 3, which are the orange box, perform similarly with each other, around 86.6 of average AUC. But other GAMs perform also very similarly. For example, FLAM has 86.4 and Spline has 86.5 as shown in the green one here, which are very close to the best model 86.6. So overall, these GAMs are reasonably accurate with each other. So here we find that the test accuracy are so close that there is no significant difference between them. So using accuracy alone is not able to distinguish which GAM is more trustworthy or better. So here we instead focus on our second comparisons, the case studies, which are the known patterns we know that exist in the data, and we see which GAM can recover them. Here we show a shape graph of feature PF ratio in MIMIC2, which is an ICU mortality prediction data. The PF ratio means the ability of converting oxygen in air into oxygen in blood. So here, the higher the better. Here, all three GAMs agree that higher PF ratio lower the risk of patients. But here, we see a sharp drop at this point. It turns out that for healthy patients, clinicians do not bother to measure this feature for them. And this missing value in the preprocessing is imputed by the mean value of this feature, which is 373. This is why we see there's a sharp drop of risk right at this value, and both EBM and FLAM capture this. But Spline is too smooth to be able to represent this and create a distorted dip around 300 to 500. This shows that EBM and FLAM is better at detecting this known pattern caused by mean imputation. We show another pattern which we call intervention artifacts. So here in this region, we find EBM has lots of ups and downs in this region. We think it's because that doctors use 175, 200, and 225 as the treatment thresholds. So the risk goes high as the blood pressure approaches 175, but then the patients get treated, so the risk drops. And then again, the risk goes higher, but then the treatment gets treated after 200, so the risk drops again, and so on. So here we see that only EBM can recover this pattern, but both Spline and FLAM are too smooth or flat to represent this known pattern. So in previous section, we showed that for two known patterns, only tree-based model EBM is able to detect them. And here we come to our third comparison, which is the feature sparsity. Intuitively, a sparse model will only focus on a few important features and ignore the weaker features. We show one of the shape graph of feature rates in COMPASS dataset, which is the reoffense rate of the criminals. And people are worried about that there's a racial bias in this dataset. Here we show two different GAMs, EBM and EBM best first. And here EBM is designed to be dense. So you will use as many features as possible to make predictions, while EBM best first will only use a few important features. So in this case, it ignores this weaker feature race. We argue that a sparse model like EBM best first might hide the pattern, in this case the race feature, and instead it will squeeze these effects to other stronger features through correlations, and thus appears to show no racial discrimination on this dataset. Similarly, we find EBM best first also has little effect on another weaker feature, gender. So we argue that a model should show as many patterns for all features to avoid hiding patterns like EBM best first. And ignoring weaker features tend to discriminate more as well on the minority groups. So here we show the cross-entropy loss for our EBM model, and we also show the cross-entropy loss for all our ethnicity subgroup and our different genders. Here we experiment that if we remove the race feature from the model, and we find that the loss increases much more for the Asian and Native American subpopulation, for 6% and 1.4%, much more than the overall increase of 0.1%. Again, if we remove the feature sex, the female minority group will increase much more than the minority male group, as shown in the red here. And finally, we compare with EBM best first, which basically has no effect on race and gender as well. And we show that it indeed has larger loss for Asian and female as well. It doesn't have that higher loss for Native American. It's probably because when we remove the sex, it surprisingly improves the minority group Native American, as shown in the third row. We repeat this analysis on adult income dataset and find similar findings. So in previous slides, we find that sparsity could hide the pattern and lead to discrimination on rare subpopulation. Here we designed a matrix to quantify which GAM is more dense or sparse. Here we show the average density of each GAM model, and we sort the model from high to low from left to right. In each row, the highest density is shown in red and the lowest is blue. First, EBM has higher number than the EBM best first, which makes sense since we design EBM to be dense and EBM best first to be sparse. Also, we find that logistic regression, which is the L2 penalized model, is more dense than the L1 penalized model lasso, which is as we expected. Finally, we find the spline, surprisingly, could have high or low feature density depending on the data. So overall, XGBL2 and the EBM, which is the left two columns, has the higher feature density, which we prefer. And for the sparse model, FLAM and EBM best first, we don't prefer them since they might hide the patterns and discriminate rare subpopulations. Finally, we come to our fourth comparison, which we call data fidelity. In real data, since we do not know the ground truth, we instead measure the data fidelity by bias variance analysis. In synthetic data, we simulate ground truth patterns and see which GAM is closest to the ground truth. In bias variance analysis, the loss of a model can be decomposed into noise, bias, and variance, and in the right figure, we show what it means. So we show that low bias means, which means the top two figures, means that the model's prediction is closer to the ground truth, which is shown in the red dot. On the other hand, the variance is the degree of how blue point spreads out with each other. As you can see how close the blue dots are in the high variance and low variance columns. And here in the explanatory modeling, we want our models to have lower bias. So here we show that if two equally accurate models, which has the same loss, and it could be having low bias, high variance, which is shown in green here, or high bias, low variance, which is shown in the red here. And in explanatory modeling, we will prefer the green one instead of the red one, because the red one will tell you something wrong very confidently. So the users might be misled by this wrong pattern. On the other hand, for the green one, although it has higher variance, but overall, on average, the pattern is much more closer to the ground truth. Here, we empirically measure the ranks of bias and variance in the data. So here, the lower rank is better. Here, x-axis is the bias rank, and y-axis is the variance rank. First, we find that XGB and FLAM has low bias and high variance, while Spline and EBM are in the more high bias but low variance ranks. So overall, we will prefer FLAM and XGBoost since they show you the patterns much more closer to the ground truth. Here, we simulate the datasets with the ground truth patterns so that we can measure how close our GAM recovers to the ground truth. And we simulate the ground truth also by GAMs. So we train 5 different GAMs on the data, and we regenerate the labels based on the outputs of these GAMs. And we code our datasets semi-synthetic because we think they are realistic to keep the correlated structure. We pick 6 datasets with 5 GAMs that generates total 30 synthetic data. And we find that what we call generator bias in this setting. So here we show one feature systolic blood pressure from MIMIC2. And this dataset is generated by Spline, as you can see in the purple line that the ground truth is pretty smooth. We find that in this dataset, the green one, Spline, is much more closer to the ground truth, which makes sense since if your data is generated by Spline, of course the Spline model will learn better. And second thing we find that is even though when the ground truth is smooth in purple, other GAMs like EBM, XGBoost, FLAM still learn sharp jumps in this data, showing that the shape graph of GAMs is highly affected by their own inductive bias, as shown in the red box here. We show another graph that's generated by FLAM, and we find similar findings that the red one, the FLAM curve, is much more closer to the purple one, the ground truth. And within the red bounding box, you can still see a lot of ups and downs from EBM and XGBoost, irrespective of the data generating distribution. So to avoid generator bias, we instead measure the worst case performance out of all 5 generators. So we're basically asking which GAM is the most robust under different patterns. Here we show that the worst score among 6 datasets, and here the higher number is better, and we sort the number from left to right from the best to the worst. And again, we see that the FLAM and XGBoost perform the best in this worst case analysis, which is the same as our previous bias and variance analysis. In summary, across all investigations we do in the paper, tree-based methods EBM and XGBoost are the best among other GAMs we experiment, as shown by having the best ranks in this summary table. Of course, the best thing is to run all the GAMs and trust the common patterns they find. We hope that future GAMs can capture rapid nonlinear changes like mean imputations. We also want future GAMs to have high feature density to prevent hiding patterns for weaker features and improve fairness. Lastly, GAMs should have higher data fidelity on both real and simulated data. Finally, thank you for your listening, and our code is available at this link.